Senator Bernie Sanders' new book, titled It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism, I'll have to check that out, released last month, contained some of his thoughts on the 2020 election, specifically the dropout of Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren, however, not conceding when they did. Sanders writes, Pete Buttigieg and Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar abruptly canceled their candidacies and endorsed Biden. Both flew to Texas, the most hotly contested of the primary states, to appear with the former vice president. They were joined by another former candidate, Texan Beto O'Rourke, in a highly choreographed show of support. The establishment had succeeded in uniting in support of Biden, the candidate who had been dividing up the candidates who had been dividing up the moderate vote.
Senator Sanders goes on writing, meanwhile, the liberal and progressive vote continued to be divided between Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren and myself. Despite poor showings in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, Warren chose to stay in the race. I was closer to her on the issues than any other candidate, but at a point where her endorsement could have been significant in a number of Super Tuesday states, she chose not to give it. Now, Bernie
do you have any thoughts or feelings about this, Briahna? I'm not sure. Are we going to be able to talk about this?
Robby, you know I do. Bernie World was up in arms over this because, look, Bernie tends not to come out swinging. He tends not to make passive-aggressive comments or really even be critical at all, but to his detriment, I would argue, even in the context of a primary race. So even though this is a kind of a light touch, him making the case that Elizabeth Warren's endorsement could have gone a long way is big for Bernie. And think about what he leaves out. He isn't here talking about the fact that in the waning weeks of the primary, she decided to throw this complaint at him that he doesn't believe a woman could be president.
That he said that
to her, completely unsourced and unvalidated, but the mainstream media went wild with it.
I remember.
And moreover, that the way that Elizabeth Warren was able to stay in through Super Tuesday was not because there were so many Americans giving into her campaign and supporting her, but she violated her own pledge to reject corporate money and took at the time, anonymous $9 million donation from what turned out to be a California billionaire who's given to any number of not very progressive causes just to stay in the race. So donations from one person were able to subvert Democratic outcomes, while Bernie Sanders, meanwhile, was obviously outraising everybody in the race based on these small $27 donations.
It's a fair thing to be bitter about years later. Like he says, all the more centrist or liberal, neoliberal candidates all got out in a hurry after, Buttigieg made his splash, got himself a lot of attention, performed pretty well in some early states, Klobuchar as well, but then they cleared the deck for Biden, endorsed him, and then everything fell together for him.
Yeah, I saw some Warren people arguing that it's her right if she thinks that Biden is the better candidate, which Bernie people responded, if you actually did care about the issues, there's no plausible world in which you would see yourself as closer to Biden than Bernie Sanders. So what's that about? Other people made the argument that, it's her choice, it's her turn, using a lot of this women's reproductive language to insulate her from what I think is legitimate criticism. And the Bernie people pointed out that, at the end of the day, she was never going to be the progressive candidate, given that she came in third in her own state, won 0 of the primary contest, never had the legs on her campaign that Bernie Sanders did. And yet there are so many people out there that still feel like it is just it's about her and her personal entitlement to run, as opposed to these movement politics that I think Bernie people have pretty consistently put first over any individual.
Warren was always in the Democratic primaries in 2020. Warren was the candidate who was the most a media creation, because the media loved, the progressive media that she was there. She was the runaway choice in this town, in D.C. Yeah. She was the most popular candidate by a mile.
She's neck and neck with Pete Buttigieg in terms of being a media creation, because at least she was a senator.
But people voted for Pete Buttigieg more so than Warren.
I will say that Pete Buttigieg had a strategy, which was to invest all of his resources, which were limited, in Iowa, so that he could claim to have an initial primary state win, and he hoped that carried him beyond the initial contest. It didn't. He only even came close to winning the one state, and due to election irregularities in Iowa, people still dispute who in fact won the state, but it was obviously very close between Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg. But whereas Bernie Sanders did very well in all of those early states, just decimating the field in the most diverse early state that voted in Nevada with 70% of the Latino population.
I'm not comparing Pete to Bernie, but Pete versus Warren.
Sure, but I completely agree with you about being a media creation. But, you know, Liz Smith was a celebrity in her own right. Pete Buttigieg's comms woman, because of the job that she did in creating Pete Buttigieg out of nowhere from being not a household name, mayor of South Bend, Indiana. What is that even? I remember being in D.C. over the course of 2018 and picking up magazines, the Washingtonian, whatever, and he seemed to be on the cover of everything. So kudos to her for manifesting that.
The New York Times endorsed Warren and Klobuchar. That was their endorsement, Warren and Klobuchar.
Who combined, by the way, and I love this because the Democratic Party loves to talk about identity politics until it's inconvenient. Combined, Warren and Klobuchar barely got to a double-digit amount of the black vote. 10% combined, Warren pulling her weight with 9%, and Klobuchar coming through with 1%. Meanwhile, Bernie, of course, was the only politician in the race other than Joe Biden who ever managed to get on his own into the double digits with the black vote. I mean, it was a really frustrating process, and it feels good and cathartic on some level for Bernie to be giving voice to what so many of us were concerned about. On the other hand, I saw some other Bernie supporters saying, it's too little too late. If you knew this was happening, if you knew the system was being rigged, if you knew that there was kind of a coordination that you felt like was undermining your fair chances, why did you concede so quickly? Why didn't you fight harder? Why didn't you try to run as a third-party candidate? And why didn't you at very least keep your organizing mechanism intact so that we would be poised to apply more concerted, organized pressure on the Biden administration to concede to the interests of a large portion of the Democratic base?
Here's a question I have for you. Is there still acrimony between the two camps, the Warren and Bernie camps?
I mean, to your point, I don't really know who the Warren camp is.
Yeah.
It was people who worked for the Warren campaign who got those tattoos. Do you remember that little scandal where she had this really comprehensive, very professionalized aesthetic program with like a color green called Liberty Green and like all of these specs for how to make the aesthetic of the campaign consistent across platforms. And a bunch of staffers had gotten the color code for Liberty Green tattooed on their arms, and there were some kind of untoward comparisons to Holocaust tattoos.
God,
it was an uncanny and not very nice resemblance going on there. But that was the kind of fanaticism that you saw for people who were literally working for her, or any number of kind of progressive, not left, but progressive journalists who, as you pointed out, were very fawning of her. But outside of that, who was it? There was obviously no voters, not even in her own state where she came in third.
Well, it's interesting to see Bernie, I agree with you, kind of acknowledging what was transparently obvious, is that everybody got out to clear the way for Biden, but not Warren to help out Bernie.
Yeah.
Very telling.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right, more Rising after this. Stay tuned.